Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are a gift of God? That is the question that Thomas Jefferson posed in 1787, right on the precipice of the creation of the Constitution of the United States, of which he was one of the main authors, of course. And so I ask, is this question still relevant in the year 2023? What do you think the place of God should be in our nation? We have, "In God we trust," imprinted on our money. We say, "One nation, under God," in our Pledge of Allegiance. The Declaration of Independence says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." But then there's that phrase, separation of church and state. Religion and government and politics, they're not supposed to go together, so what's with all this God talk? Indeed, secularism and atheism, they're on the rise. Look at the data from the Pew Research Center that shows now 3 in 10 Americans are religiously unaffiliated. Sure, the vast majority still identify as Christian, but this is down from 75% just a decade ago. So that is a huge change in a very short period of time. And according to this article, the secularizing shifts evident in American society so far in the 21st century show no sign of slowing. The latest Pew Research Center survey of religious composition of the United States finds the religiously unaffiliated share of the public is 6 percentage points higher than it was even 5 years ago, and 10 points higher than a decade ago. Christians continue to make up the majority of the U.S. populace, but their share of the adult population is 12 points lower in 2021 than it was in 2011. In addition, the share of U.S. adults who say they pray on a daily basis has been trending downward, as has the share who say religion is very important in their lives. The article goes through many different data points, and I encourage you to go check those out yourself, but the trends are clear. Fewer people are religiously affiliated, fewer people are praying, fewer people believe that God is an important presence in their daily lives. We are just getting into this, but as always, I want to know your thoughts in those comments down below. And of course, if you haven't already, make sure you've hit that like button, you're subscribed to the channel, and hit those notification bells so you don't miss any of my videos, because this is what we do on this channel. We ask the hard questions and we try to make a little bit more sense out of this crazy world. And you should know that every Saturday night between 8 and 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we go live looking at the headlines from the week, the trending topics, and breaking them down, going beyond those headlines. So make sure you join us Saturday nights. And if you're into that sort of thing, make sure you're following me on Instagram and Twitter for some daily doses of my thoughts on current events and a little bit of me being a mom. And if you're really into what we do over here, make sure you head over to TeachingLiberty.org so we can stay directly connected. Sign up for the newsletter, check out what we have going on in the shop, and you can become a member of our community. This video is dedicated to my friend Brendan Saunders. I only knew Brendan for a short period of time, but in that time, he made a big impact on my life. His dedication to his family, his dedication to his community and this country, and most of all, his deep faith in Lord Almighty God. Brendan leaves behind his wife and his 16-year-old daughter. Please consider donating to their GoFundMe, which I've linked in the description down below, to support them through this difficult time and to help send his daughter to college. So what should the place of God be in our country and society? Should we place more value on God, or are we better off as a more secular society? I think before we can answer this question, we need to define what is meant by God and what is meant by secular. First, let's talk about God. By God, I mean our Creator. You may call him Yahweh, Yeshua, Allah, whatever your preferred title. In this video, I'm going to refer to that as God. And by that, I mean the source of life. You are alive. And by virtue of that, you have the right to live and the liberty to do so as you please. So long, of course, as you don't infringe upon the life and liberty of others. So this isn't about any particular religion or religious practices. This is simply the acknowledgement that there is a God, and that God is the source of life and of our right to live. Of course, oftentimes one's belief in God is expressed through identification with a particular religion or religious practices. But I want to be very clear. When I refer to God, I'm not referring to any particular religion or religious practices. What I am referring to is the common acknowledgement that God is the source of life and our liberties. And we're going to come back to this distinction between one's belief in God and one's religious practices. It's a very important distinction for understanding what is meant between the separation of church and state. But before we get there, let's get into what is meant by secularism. What does a secular society mean and look like? And to do that, we're going to look at a Washington Post article from January of 2022 titled "American Secularism is Growing and Growing More Complicated." And in this article, the author reviews a new crop of books that have been recently published on the topic of secularism and the important ramifications. The article starts, "Americans are getting less religious. You've probably heard. They do fewer traditionally religious things such as belonging to a denomination, attending worship services, or feeling certain that God exists." And yes, we went over that data at the beginning of the video, though I don't think we need the data to confirm what we can all see in the world around us. God is less valued in our society than it was even 2 decades ago. But here's the important question. What does that lead to? As research in the past couple of decades has reflected those drops in behaviors and beliefs, conventional wisdom has lingered on a superficial understanding about what it really means for our identities, our yearnings for something bigger than ourselves, and our ideas about the role of religion in politics. And I do think that to a certain extent, this is true. I was just expressing this feeling, but it's important to dive into it. What does this really mean? What are people's actual beliefs? Is it as easy as saying these people believe in God and these people don't? These people are religious and these people aren't? I don't think it is. And that's, I think, what these books actually do accurately reflect, and I think that's important to understand. Now, a new crop of books dives into the many shades of gray in growing secularism and its important ramifications. Deploying new research and theories, these writers go beyond the top-level data and argue that many Americans are, in fact, a mix. Someone may be devout personally, for instance, but strongly believe in church-state separation and the primacy of science and observable facts. They may be completely non-religious, but also agnostic when it comes to the role of religion in public life. And I think that this is very important to recognize, that there's not uniformity in our beliefs. Even if you look within the religions, I'm Jewish, and there's so many different sects, and even within those, practices and traditions vary. But I think there's something really interesting that's done here and not said explicitly. The way that it's framed is that anything that has to do with God should be separate from the affairs of the state. But as we're going to dive into, that is not what the separation of church and state is. The separation of church and state is just that. It's the separation of church, of the religious institution, of the state showing preference to any particular religious practices or expressions, not a denial of the existence of God. In fact, the whole premise of our government is on the existence of God. And that existence of God allows you to freely practice your religion and your worship of God however you want. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. Let's continue on with our definition of a secular society. In 2021, the book Secular Surge by a trio of prominent political scientists says secular core values include free thinking, logic and reason, rather than perceived authority, human experience, and the laws of nature. And so once again, they conflate God and religion as one thing, and that those things are completely separate from the realm of free thinking, of logic, of reason. And yet they go on to say that people who are more secular believe in natural law. Are the laws of nature not a received authority? I think it's that disconnect between natural law and God, that received authority, which lies at the heart of this conundrum. And so now that we have our definition of what is meant by God and placing more value on God in our society versus what is meant by moving it more in the direction of secularism, let's reconsider our question. Is this secular surge more of a good thing for our country, or is it more of a bad thing? Would we be better off as a nation if more people believed in God, if our lives were more centered around our faith in God? Is this how we should even be framing the question? And I think the framing is extremely important, because I certainly want to account for the fact that we are living in the here and now, and by virtue of that, we are more prone to the perception that these times are more tumultuous and more divisive than ones in the past. Are these times really more tumultuous and more divisive, or is it just our perception? Because if these times are no more or no less tumultuous and divisive than any other in the past, then whether we believe in God or not wouldn't really be a factor. You can believe in God, you cannot believe in God, and the world is just going to go through phases of good and bad. If, however, we can say that these are more tumultuous and more divisive times, and that tumultuousness and divisiveness came about at the exact time that we became less faithful in God. Of course, correlation is not causation, but there would at least be a valid argument to be made. But I don't want to just take that premise that these are more tumultuous and divisive times at face value. We've been through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Cold War, the struggle for civil rights. And apparently during those times, Americans were more likely to believe in God and to attend church. Apparently during those times, God was of higher value in society. So it's not like there was some magical time where everyone believed in God and everything was wonderful in the world. And I certainly think it is possible that God has nothing to do with this, that these times are no more tumultuous or divisive, but rather that there's more people alive on this earth than there ever had been at any other point in history. And we are more aware of what's going on in the world because of the 24-hour news cycle and all of the technology. Again, there are many confounding factors, and that less people believe in God and that less people are affiliated with religious organizations could have nothing to do with our current state of affairs. Or that it's just one small factor among many, and it's no more or less important than the other things that are also occurring in the world. Sure, that could be the case, but I'll tell you why I don't think that's true, and why I do think it is this move towards secularism that is driving the divisiveness in our society, or at the very least, does not hold the answers to the problems of our time. And I'll tell you why I think that we need more God, why we need a society that places more value on the belief and faith in God. Again, not any particular religion, practice as you will, but that we need to recenter our society around the self-evident fact that all men are created equal because we have been endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. We need more of that. It is awesome to be alive, but you can't enjoy the fruits of that conclusion without recognizing its source. And its source is God, Yahweh, Yeshua, Allah, whatever your preferred title. That is the source of life. To further demonstrate my point, let's return to the question I opened the video with. Can the liberties of a nation be secured when we have removed a conviction that those liberties are a gift from God? Again, this is Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers and the main author of the Declaration of Independence. And this comes from his notes on the state of Virginia written in 1787. So he was writing this just over a decade into this American experiment. The Americans had won the Revolutionary War and were realizing that the Articles of Confederation, so the original Constitution, was not sufficient. And so delegates from all the colonies, once again, were gathering, and they came up with what is now our Constitution. And of course, at this point, the institution of slavery is a key feature of American society. And so Jefferson is wrestling what this means for the character of our nation. Query 18, the particular customs and manners that may happen to be received in that state. It is difficult to determine on the standard by which the manners of a nation may be tried, whether Catholic or particular. It is more difficult for a native to bring to that standard the manners of his own nation, familiarized to him by habit. There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on one part, and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. This quality is the germ of all education in him. From his cradle to his grave, he is learning to do what he sees others do. If a parent could find no motive either in his philanthropy or his self-love for restraining the intemperance of passion towards his slave, it should always be a sufficient one that his child is present. But generally it is not sufficient. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on some airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives a loose to the worst of passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped by with odious peculiarities. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. And with what execration should the statesman be loaded? Execrations are loathings. Who, permitting a one half of the citizens thus to trample on the rights of the other, transforms those into despots and these into enemies, destroys the morals of the one part and the amor patriae of the other. Amor patriae means love of one's country. So what he's noting here is that the institution of slavery is bankrupt of morals and only sets up a country for division. For if a slave can have a country in this world, it must be any other preference to that which he is born to live and labor for another, in which he must lock up the faculties of his nature, contribute as far as depends on his individual endeavors to the evanishment of the human race, or entail his own miserable condition on the endless generations proceeding from him. How can we have good manners? How can we be a nation of good moral character when some men are more equal than others, when some men are subjugated to others? And not only that, he goes on then to say, it's not only that you are immoral, but you will lose whatever you gain from these immoral ways. He says, with the morals of the people, their industry is also destroyed. For in a warm climate, no man will labor for himself who can make another labor for him. This is so true that of the proprietors of slaves, a very small proportion indeed are ever seen to labor. So if you don't do the work, you ultimately cannot reap the benefits. And so this brings us to the question, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis? A conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is among possible events. These are those secular values. You believe in science, math, data, numbers. You believe in the laws of nature. However, when those are separated from the acknowledgement that they are a gift from God, life is just a wheel of fortune. There's any number of possible events that could happen, and None is any better than the other. So let's read that part one more time. Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis? A conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. But it is impossible to be temperate and to pursue this subject through the various considerations of policy, of morals, of natural history, and civil. We must be contented to hope that they will force their way into everyone's mind. I think a change already perceptible since the origin of the present revolution. The spirit of the master is abating, that of the slave rising from the dust, his condition mollifying, the way I hope preparing under the auspices of heaven for total emancipation, and that this is disposed in the order of events to be the consent of the masters rather than by their extirpation. As I'm recording this video, I'm realizing it's less about these being more divisive or tumultuous times or having more at stake. I don't think that we could really even fairly judge that. There are arguments to be made, sure. But I think it's more that we don't even know if we're headed in the right direction because we don't have a bearing by which to judge what is right and wrong. To explore this idea and further demonstrate what I'm trying to say, let's revisit the values and beliefs associated with secularism. In the article, it explains secularism includes people who may be personally devout, but strongly believe in church-state separation and the primacy of science and observable facts. As I started to point out when we were reading the article, what secularists do is they take anything that has to do with God and religion and they put it together in one space, and that cannot be anywhere near government and politics. And at the same time, they separate religion and God from science and fact. However, this modern notion that God and religion are one thing which must be completely separate from these other areas of life is divorced from the history. The phrase, the separation of church and state, is actually derived from an 1802 letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut. And the purpose of this letter was to explain his interpretation of the First Amendment as it related to religious liberties. So let's take a second and remind ourselves what the First Amendment says. The government shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. These are known as the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And what this does not mean is that God is completely separate from government. This is how Thomas Jefferson explained it in that 1802 letter. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between a man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence the act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. What this means is that the government cannot establish an official state religion, nor can it show favor or disfavor to any people or groups because of their religious practices or beliefs. Again, this is very different from saying the government should be separate from God. While it seems so simple, I can certainly understand the confusion and the way that our modern culture has conflated God and religion to be the same thing. And as we've noted, it's not always clear-cut. The two certainly have a relationship with each other. But again, you can all share the same belief in God and have different ways of expressing and practicing that belief. I myself can even remember thinking, why does it say in God we trust on our money? Why do we say one nation under God? And that was certainly a time in my life when my belief and faith in God was far less certain. And I believe that uncertainty stems from the culture around us that sends us those signals. Consider the religious liberty cases that were recently decided in the Supreme Court. The three cases are Shurtleff v. Boston, Carson v. Macon, and Kennedy v. Bremerton School District. In all three of these cases, the government withheld opportunities or funds from people or institutions based on their religious beliefs and practices, where they otherwise granted them to non-religiously affiliated organizations or people. For example, in the one case, the city of Boston allows groups and organizations that are holding events and rallies in front of town hall to hoist their flag on the pole. However, a religiously affiliated group was denied this opportunity because they were religiously affiliated. If it were another group that did not have a religious affiliation, they could have had this. So the only reason the government treated this organization differently is because they were affiliated with a religion. So the government was actually discriminating against this group, denying them the equal opportunity that any other person or group would have had just because of their religion. Now, there are certainly arguments to be had on both sides, but let's go ahead and take a look at how this topic was presented in our corporate media. So this one comes from Reuters. U.S. Supreme Court takes aim at separation of church and state. Right away from the title, we can see what the bias is of this news organization. The conservative majority U.S. Supreme Court has chipped away at the wall separating church and state in a series of new rulings, eroding American legal traditions intended to prevent government officials from promoting any particular faith. In 3 decisions in the past 8 weeks, the court has ruled against government officials whose policies and actions were taken to avoid violating the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment prohibition on governmental endorsement of religion known as the Establishment Clause. The article goes on to explain the 3 cases. I'll just read the summary of the case that we went over. On May 2nd, the court ruled in favor of a Christian group that sought to fly a flag emblazoned with a cross at Boston City Hall under a program aimed at promoting diversity and tolerance among the city's different communities. As you can see from the framing of the article, it is not diverse or tolerant to fly a flag with a cross, but other flags representing non-religious communities, that apparently is. But we're not supposed to look at it from this objective standard. We're just supposed to see God and religion. That should be separate. Everything that is non-religious and non-God related, that's good. We can talk about that in public. The article goes on to say, the court's conservative justices who hold a 6-3 majority in particular have taken a broad view of religious rights. The article goes on to quote a Cornell Law School professor. They regard secularism, which for centuries has been the liberal world's understanding of what it means to be neutral, as itself a form of discrimination against religion, Dorff said of the conservative justices. So you see here how he takes the liberal world order and removes God from it, pretending as if those liberal rights, as if that liberal order is not based on the recognition that it comes from God. One of the conservative justices explained the decision, saying the court's aim was to prevent public officials from being hostile to religion as they navigate the Establishment Clause. Gorsuch said that in no world may government entities' concern about phantom violations justify actual violations of an individual's First Amendment rights. Interestingly, they do bring in the context about the 1802 letter Jefferson wrote, but this is how they explain it. They say, Jefferson, who famously said in an 1802 letter that the Establishment Clause should represent a wall of separation between church and state, the provision prevents the government from establishing a state religion and prohibits it from favoring one faith over another. In the 3 recent rulings, the court decided that government actions intended to maintain a separation of church and state had instead infringed separate rights to free speech or the free exercise of religion, also protected by the First Amendment. But as liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote in the main case, this is a case where the state was giving funds to family through a school choice program, but wasn't allowing them to use it at religious schools. They could use it at equivalent schools that were non-religious, but not at those religious schools. And the Supreme Court found that that violates their First Amendment rights. You can't treat schools differently just because one is religious and one is non-religious. The state in this way is not promoting a religion. It's just treating those people as they would treat any other people without religious beliefs. So as Sotomayor wrote in that main case, such an approach leads us to a place where separation of church and state becomes a constitutional violation. Another quote from the article says, "It's a whole new door that the court has opened to what teachers, coaches, and government employees can do when it comes to proselytizing children," said Nick Little, legal director for the Center for Inquiry, a group promoting secularism and science. So they're trying to make it seem like this is a new take on the separation of church and state, when really theirs is the new take. The idea that people who have religious practices should be treated differently from people who aren't religious, that's new. The idea that God should not at all be involved in government or politics, that is a new idea. The article ends like this. Following Monday's ruling, many issues relating to religious conduct in schools may be litigated anew under the court's rationale that the conduct must be coercive in order to raise Establishment Clause concerns. Every classroom, Garnett said, is a courtroom. And I would say this article is very reflective of where the culture has been moving over the past 2 decades. It's not an understanding you necessarily gain from any particular happening or any particular moment in time, but rather it's the cultural milieu of the time. Going back to the article on secularism from earlier, another quote said, "Secular core values include free thinking, logic, and reason, human experience, and the laws of nature." And they juxtapose that to religion, which they define as received authority. And so again, you can see what the secularists have done. They've taken the laws of nature and they've separated them from God. They no longer acknowledge that the laws of nature are a received authority. And by doing so, they've taken away the ability for there to be an objective truth. If the laws of nature are not given to us by God, then the laws of nature are susceptible to be redefined by any free-thinking, logic, and reason-using person. The laws of nature become conflated with the greater good. And with no objective truth from which to operate, the forces of domination can win with little resistance. Because when you separate reason and logic from God, when you separate the laws of nature from God, it actually leaves you far more susceptible to received authority. It leaves you far less capable of thinking freely and actually applying reason and logic in a consistent and rational way. I think the past 3 years have proved that to be true. Those using pure reason and logic said to follow the experts, trust the science. And of course, this was all in the name of the greater good. Yet that greater good, untethered from a belief in God, from that objective truth that God gave us life and as such we are all equal to live it with liberty how we please, by disconnecting it from that, the greater good can be changed and redefined as it suits the agenda of the moment. Don't wear a mask. Just kidding, wear a mask. We were just telling you not to wear a mask because we were worried that the healthcare workers weren't going to have the mask, but now we have enough, so everyone should wear masks. Or these stores can open, these people can work because they're essential. While these stores and those people, they're non-essential. These decisions were completely arbitrary. They were based on some notion of what the greatest good was or what was most politically expedient at the moment. But if we have a common belief in God and that our rights and the liberty to live that life come from God and God alone, we have an objective truth from which to judge some profess greater good. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that they are a gift from God? I can't help but feel I've fallen short of the task of answering this question. And yet, that's the nature of faith. It requires a certain leap in logic, a certain surrendering of your human desires, a humility to the infinite nature of God. We don't know all the answers. The experts don't, the scientists don't, the clerics don't, and we certainly can't define the greater good in our limited human capacity. And so I think it's appropriate to close with a reading of Psalm 90. I believe it captures the heart of the matters discussed in this video. And it also happens to be the verse that my friend Brendan Saunders, who I've dedicated this video to, was working with in the time leading up to his passing. I don't know the work that Brendan was doing personally with this verse, but I do believe him leaving us with a reference to it is a message directly from God. It should serve as a guiding light as we contend with the issues before us individually and as a nation. A prayer of Moses, the man of God. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it is dry and withered. We are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All our days pass away underneath your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures. Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. If only we knew the power of your anger. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Relent, Lord. How long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen trouble. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Thank you for joining me for this video. I know it wasn't a short one, and this isn't an easy topic. I'm certainly not here trying to act like I have all the answers, but this is where my thinking is at this current point in time. And I'd love to know your thoughts. Leave me a comment down below. Check in with me over on Instagram and Twitter. See what we've got going on at TeachingLiberty.org and share this video. Spread the good word of liberty far and wide, because when we think free, we live free.